Thanks, John, and good evening, everyone, or hello from Paris. Though I spent a number of years in the New Jersey area, it feels like coming home almost, like the native son returning home to be able to join you this evening. I served for a time as the Chief Security Officer of Lucent, as we were headquartered there in Murray Hill, and then later as the head of security at Honeywell out there in Morristown. So participating this evening is, for me, somewhat like the native son coming home. I actually spent a decade in academia myself, thereafter a decade of service in the government, in the three-letter agencies, the FBI always paying my salary, but lending me to the CIA, DOE, DOD, and a number of other agencies, and then eventually migrating to the private sector where I've been for the last 20 years as in various roles as a chief security officer. But reflecting back over those times clearly brought to mind this old phrase, may you live in interesting times. Growing up, I always thought of that as a blessing. I hated being born, and the worst thing I could think of as being bored. It wasn't until recently some colleagues of mine pointed out that Robert Kennedy, in a speech he gave shortly before his death down in South Africa, actually referred to this phrase as an old Chinese curse. But whether we think of it as a curse or a blessing, what really characterizes these times is interesting in my mind is the pace and rate at which technologies are evolving and advancing, and particularly cyber. Tom Friedman, it's amazing as I think and reflect that it's already been a decade since he wrote his iconic work, The World is Flat. But we liked his book particularly well at Dell when I was there because he had a chapter on our supply chain innovative efforts. But I liked him particularly because he was, I think, one of the first writers to observe or opine that our age today would be characterized by the fact that traditional boundaries of interests would grow ever more porous, whether that's the one we draw between cyber and physical, domestic and international, public and private, church and state, business security, you name it, come up with any dichotomy, and we would see how in today's environment, cultural environment, the traditional boundaries are growing ever more porous. And of course, that porosity is being exacerbated now by what we call or is seen to evolve and be rolled out as the Internet of Things, or what I like to say or call the Internet of Everything, because I've noticed that part of the elements that are now joining that internet are not just the household appliances, the driverless cars, cameras, but also humans are actually connecting themselves to their brains to that internet. And I know humans usually take umbrage if they're ever referred to as a thing. So that's why I find myself referring it to the Internet of Everything. But with that growing connectivity and that Internet of Everything, we see that, of course, there's come an increase in the number of threat vectors, avenues of attacks open to the adversaries that we're up against. And of course, we in the security profession, particularly those of us, particularly Alan, I know you and I have been at this a long, long time. Those of us who've been in that business as long as we have always aspired to be proactively preventative in our efforts to do battle against those attacks, but have unfortunately found ourselves stymied in the world of reactive detection. We always aspire to be that proverbial fence at the top of the hill, but almost inevitably found ourselves at the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff after the damage was done. And of course, those memories and those efforts aren't always something we like to reflect on and remember. My training as an undergraduate was in philosophy, and one of my favorite philosophers was George Santana, who reminds us that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I think there's perhaps no more dramatic instances of the importance of remembering than perhaps, again, what we can draw following Matt's example from a war situation back in World War I or World War II, when the Nazis started launching their threats via the flying bomb towards Europe or England. And the response was that of reactive detection. Post-execution, they would launch the V-1, and we had our barrage balloons up, our anti-aircraft guns. We even sent some poor Spitfire pilots up there to try and knock those suckers off course. All of that was very resource intensive, very complex, very expensive, and ultimately ineffective. Of course, with the advent of the next generation of threats that really showed the inadequacies of our first approach, the V-2 rocket, we finally got it right and turned our attention to what we call proactive prevention, where in Operation Crossbow, we started to actually target and focus in pre-execution on the site of construction and launch of those V-2 rockets. And it's at that point that the tide really began to turn for us. So we have this historical record, this historical lesson of why it's important, notwithstanding the pull and the attraction and the stymied way in which we feel we have to stay in the reactive detection zone, the importance of moving as quickly and as whenever possible into that proactive prevention space. Now, of course, my personal introduction to the world of reactive occurred quite early on in my professional career. I finished a law degree, an MBA, and reached a conclusion that I wanted to head towards academia, Matt, where you are now, and decided I would pursue a PhD in a critical field of study upon which the stability of the universe teeters at this very moment. Wait for it. Hermeneutics. It's a hodgepodge of psychology. If I were looking at everybody's face, and I can't see them now, I'd probably see a lot of glaring looks, or I get a lot of deer in the headlights looks when I mention hermeneutics. It's a hodgepodge of psychology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, and linguistics, all woven together in a way that looks at the variables around which human beings construct or interpret their world. If it hadn't been for the fact that the FBI got it in their mind that they needed a hermeneuticist, I was pretty sure that they didn't. We had an extensive debate on that topic. At the end of the day, they said, look, we've got a testing instrument that includes 4 months of training at Quantico. If you're not right for our organization, that instrument will kick you out. I said, well, look, I just finished an MBA where I studied these testing instruments. I'm not sure I have that same confidence, but okay, the gauntlet's down. Let's do it. At the end of 4 months, I was walking across the stage. They handed me a weapon and a badge and promptly sent me out to Los Angeles, where they were about to invoke a new model of going up against terrorism called the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The TV buffs out there might remember the show 24, Jack Bauer and his team. This was the group upon which that TV show was predicated. But I remember showing up there, and I could see that Jack Bauer is placing bets under the table at just how long this hermeneuticist was going to last. And even though, and I admire these men and women greatly, even though they desire to be proactively preventative, one of the things I noticed almost immediately is that we were in the reactive mode. We worked Lockerbie, the plane that was brought down over to Scotland. For those that were younger in our midst may not remember that, but we worked that case. Oklahoma City bombing, after it had already happened, chased the perpetrator of that heinous act. And I was one of many who can claim that I unsuccessfully chased the Unabomber, all in a reactive mode. But I told myself, well, look, this is in the physical world. When we finally move off into the cyber realm, by golly, things are going to change. And then one day the boss came into the bullpen and shouted out, hey guys, who here knows anything about Unix? Now, I grew up in Libya before the Six-Day War. My dad was a pilot. I lived out amongst the Arab kids on the edge of the Sahara. And I remember them, even at that time, talking about the 6,000 Libyan warriors that went up against Pharaoh in battle. Those that were not killed were all castrated and sent home as eunuchs. Well, I said to myself, I don't know what the rest of these mopes may know about Unix, but I'm anxious to show value as a hermeneuticist. I raised my hand. The boss plopped the file down and says, McClurg, don't screw this up. National security is involved. So I opened the book or the file and started looking for that eunuch. Didn't see him anywhere. Never did find him, in fact. There was a whole bunch, however, about Unix, the operating system upon which the phone systems, the Bell-Cor's phone systems were predicated, and was that which a young phreaker, which is a hacker that targets the phone system, a young phreaker by the name of Dark Dante, had gone after. He was supposedly a rehabilitated hacker as a young man. We'd hired him to work some of the war games, support the war games of the military, and he apparently returned to his old behaviors. He was actually breaking into Pac Bell offices at night and stealing passwords, equipment, Bell-Core manuals, taking it home, studying it to the wee hours of the morning, and then advancing a far more sophisticated cyber attack than he ever would have been able to do, but for the 30-year-old rusty lock of the central office's phone office door. He had digitized a photo of himself picking that 30-year-old rusty lock with his grandfather's pick set. And once he gained access, of course, he leveraged that to then advance and do damage in a way that he wouldn't have been able to do but for that physical vulnerability. And the flip side of that coin was already starting to emerge in the eyes of the task force, because we saw in the SCADA systems that controlled the water, the power of the systems of Los Angeles, these SCADA systems had cyber vulnerabilities, which when exploited would undermine a physical vulnerability. This was well before Stuxnet and the lessons that we learned from that, from the Iranian nuclear compromise. But in these early days in Los Angeles, that side of the coin was already starting to emerge. And it dawned on me, hey, this is the future we're looking at here, where we'll see a growing number of interdependencies between cyber and physical and cyber, and that the adversaries will look to exploit those interdependencies. And that the way we can optimally position ourselves to perhaps do battle in this space was to converge these historically siloed programs. Cybersecurity over here, physical security over here, bringing them together under one operational umbrella where we might be less likely, though there's no guarantee of overlooking those interdependencies. The FBI started actually sending me on the road. I did a little road show for a couple of years, championing the lessons learned as a result of the Dark Dante case. A lot of the corporations in America were clapping their hands and saying, yes, this makes sense. But I noticed very few of them were actually developing these converged house model. PwC had listened to me present, and they came up to me and said, John, don't worry, that the model's right. There's just not enough of you quite yet that feel comfortable straddling both worlds in order to advance converged models. I thought to myself, well, wow, how comfortable do you have to really feel? I'm the guy, after all, who thought it was a eunuch. But he said, give it some time. And I've continued to monitor the Fortune 500, particularly the large businesses there in the New York, New Jersey area. A lot of the Fortune 500 are indeed moving or migrating gradually to these converged organizational structures where physical and cybersecurity are managed hand in glove under one operational umbrella. Shortly after I did battle with Dark Dante, bad news broke back in Washington that Aldrich Ames had been spying for the Russians for years. The FBI and the CIA took black eyes because of that, because it was found that if we'd only played better together, we could have caught Nicholson at least years earlier and maybe saved the 10 lives of the assets that we lost. President Clinton particularly was irritated and signed an executive order that basically gave counter-espionage responsibilities to the FBI. The FBI promptly put two of us in what I call light cover at the CIA to advance or take control or management of this counter-espionage program. We knew there was yet another spy. We also knew there were like 300 of the CIA personnel who had not yet resolved their polygraphs. That was an aspect of the Ames case that came to light, that if we'd actually focused on that a little earlier, we may have in fact caught Aldrich a little sooner. So by day, my job was to look at these unresolved polygraphs, and by night it was to look and find out who the next or the other spy was. Actually, out of a short list of individuals, a guy by the name of Harold Jim Nicholson emerged. We actually followed him to Singapore, where he was going on vacation, or at least so he claimed. On his first day of vacation, spent the entire day walking around town, looking in the pane glass windows of the department stores that make up the downtown Singapore area. Boy, I thought, man, I'm even more fun than that on my vacation. But clearly what he was doing is what we know in the industry as dry cleaning. He wasn't looking at what was behind the pane glass. He was looking for reflections in the glass, looking to pick up on that surveillance. And at the end of the third day, a big black limo pulled up to the curb, the door opened up, and Jim hopped in. We looked down at the license plate, Russian embassy. We had our spy. But having our spy and being able to convict him were two different things. We then had to figure out where are we going to place this guy while we build the case against him. Now, remember, this is pre-9/11. And so we decided we'd put him in the counterterrorism center out at CIA. We managed to manipulate him in a way that he hired a deputy who was in on it and knew what he was up to. And so we leveraged, his name was John. We leveraged John extensively in trying to watch and follow Jim's activities. But almost immediately, I noticed Jim survey the physical and cyber environments of the agency and figure out which of the two he was going to exploit in trying to advance his activities. Neither of those worlds were done in a very shoddy manner. Both the cyber and the physical were top drawer operations. CIA was one of the first to deploy digital rights management. And of course, the physical security, Hollywood's had a fun time with the different controls that the agency has out there. Ultimately, Jim decided it was in the physical realm that he would best succeed, and he would proceed to take pictures with an old-fashioned camera of what the Russians wanted, put it in his pocket, and walk it out past the guards who were not doing body searches. Of course, what Jim didn't know is that we had a fiber optic camera in that little pinhole up in the ceiling that was taking pictures of him taking pictures, and it was that information that we ultimately eventually used to convict Jim. That and the information we were able to pull off his laptop one night after we had sent him on a bogus mission to Europe. We put his van on a flatbed, moved it into a Quonset hut so the odometer wouldn't move at all, and managed to come up with his laptop and did a quick image and forensics job on that laptop. We'd made some progress since my time working Dark Dante, but we're able to find on that laptop a tasking order from his Russian handler. So that really closed the lid on Jim as far as his spying activities, but it showed that relationship between the physical and the cyber that he played and he exploited. He's famous because he's also known to have 10 years later, as he was sitting in prison, recruiting his own son to resume the spying of the family. If you'd like to see more about that, CNN recently did a declassified version of the whole affair called The Spy's Son, and you can watch that. And I understand Paramount Pictures has even picked up the movie rights. Nicholson is going to be played by De Niro, apparently, and the son will be by Shia LaBeouf. And, well, me, I'm not sure. I've heard Matt Damon thrown out there, but we'll see. They'll probably do an abstracted character there so they don't have to pay me any money. But it was that combination of experiences that further solidified in my mind this paradigm of the physical and the cyber coming together under one umbrella. After the success out of the CIA, the FBI actually pulled me back into headquarters. And Alan Brill, I think you'll maybe remember these days, Ken Guidey and I helped pull together the CTAC, the first cyber center for the FBI. We knew where the future was going and that we needed to get ourselves positioned to do battle there. It wasn't shortly thereafter, though, that the FBI lent me to DOE to support DOE's efforts in the first CI cyber office that they created. They were pulling together their supercomputers in one huge network, and that seemed to be going well until I asked them one day, well, who do we intend to use all this power? They looked at me kind of in a puzzled way and said, well, the computer science departments of America, of course. So, well, when was the last time you visited one of those? Matt, you sit in one of them, I guess, now. I said, the last time I visited them, a lot of the students are foreign nationals who are on the export control list. We got to rethink what we're going to do here. In fact, that was quite disturbing, and I'm not sure they ever resolved that. I got pulled away and enticed by Bell Labs Lucent that was being jettisoned from AT&T to join them as their first CSO. They asked me, hey, we've heard about your converged model, physical and cyber under one umbrella. Can you really do that? I said, well, that's a good question. I sure think I can. And the opportunity is enticing, particularly since right now, having come up through the ranks of the FBI at a pace that no one had really planned on, there was no set cyber path at the time. I had reached the ceiling of the SES service, and the Bureau was telling me John, you're just too young. I said, look, guys, I'm your attorney. I taught you better than that. You can't say it that way. You have to say my knowledge, skills, and abilities aren't right for the SES. I said, well, we're not going to tell you that. I said, well, let's just leave it alone. The private sector wants to try the model. I'm going to go and we're going to see if we can make it work. And that was a shock because up until that time, there weren't many people who would ever leave the Bureau before they hit their full 20. They said, boy, you're really going to take a risk. And it dawned on me as I reflected on this life I was going to now assume in the private sector, that the chances of my not succeeding were not inconsequential. There was already a sense and an appreciation of the anemic performance of signature-based. And Jeff, you began this morning or this afternoon talking about signature-based viruses. So there was already an appreciation of the anemic performance of that mode of protection. And that because of that, it was probably not if, but when I was going to get compromised out in the private sector. It was then a little voice went off in my head. I remembered some training I got in my MBA program. Remember this? It says, under promise, over deliver. I said, well, I need to massage the expectations of my leadership here very quickly, or my FBI buddies will be having the laugh last as I get fired quickly after jumping to the private sector. So I explained and I massaged the expectations of the leadership to understand that given these variables, particularly the anemic, weak performance of signature-based antivirus, that it was not if, but when we were going to get compromised. And sure enough, both at Lucent and subsequently later at Honeywell, where I left after Lucent, we were indeed compromised in each of those companies, and in large part because of the anemic performance of signature-based antivirus. And that's notwithstanding the fact that I had gone to great lengths to create what we call a defense in depth structure. That philosophy of defense in depth was only just emerging at the time, but it really made sense. If you think of the kill chain analogy, and that's also a mode of speaking that's emerged in recent years, but high up in the kill chain was always positioned this antivirus partner. If they were going to fail you and perform in such a poor manner up high in that kill chain, then it was going to necessitate a structure that had some depth to it, so that as it failed at one level, you can have hopes that subsequent lower levels would catch and contain the adversary. It was very complex. It was very costly. It was reactive. It was post-execution. And ultimately, as I could bear testimony to, ultimately ineffective. Clearly, a new paradigm was required. After I experienced those compromises at Honeywell, when I left or at Lucent, I left for Honeywell, where we were convinced that we were going to implement the same converged house again in a very different business, an old-fashioned manufacturing organization. And as I arrived there, it was the summer that a lot of the oil companies in Texas were being hit by APT. And I thought, wow, here is Honeywell. We're about to go up in negotiations with the Chinese to discuss the building of a platform that will go up against Airbus, Boeing in the aviation environment. And I said, if there's anyone who should be on that victim list right now, it should be us. But I had a hermeneutics problem. As I would go and look at the logs and try and interpret them and look for anything pernicious or insidious in the logs, I couldn't see it. I couldn't see my gut was telling me it had to be there. It was shortly thereafter that I got a call from my buddies back at the FBI saying, "Hey, John, we've been looking at a Chinese bot master for some time now, under the proper authorization of a FISA court order," which is topical for today's discussions. But we've been watching this, and we have to tell you that we've noted that one of the boxes that emanates out regularly to this Chinese bot master falls within your network. I said, well, there you have it. I knew we had to be on the victim list, and sure enough, there you are. So I had to take that long walk. It's always up to the third floor or higher, up to the executive suite, to let them know that once again, remember when I told you it was not if, but when? Well, it's not if, it's when. It's happened. And to the credit of the leadership of the Honeywell team, instead of telling me to bring it down right away, which is what historically the reaction of leadership is, they said, John, you've got 3 months to find out just how badly and deeply they've hurt us. I said, wow, that 3 months was the longest 3 years of my life. And it was humbling. It was humbling, not so much because of the prowess of the compromise. It was tied to malware, a spear phishing attack. And then after they got in, they do what they always do. They go as deep as they can, and they go for the super user, as the powerful user. So all those things were elements of this attack. But what really scared me and humbled me was the fact that we determined that they'd actually gotten in 2 years earlier. And that once in, they'd shut down and gone silent and waited for 2 years for what they knew was that upcoming negotiation. And in the eve of that negotiation, resurrected it and launched it against the members of that negotiating team. That kind of discipline is what scared me to death. And so after some time, we figured we had them figured out. We'd had the back doors closed or ready to be closed. And the question was, well, when do we bring these suckers down? Well, there was a lot of debate about that. Some wanted to demarche the Chinese. I said, look, my cousin's the ambassador over there, and we just saw the Brits try that a few weeks ago, and all they got for their trouble was, no, not us. You had a Dark Dante, we have a Dark Dante. And that's true. The Chinese do have Dark Dantes. And when I was chasing Dark Dante, I know that when I was chasing him, he was always looking over his shoulder, trying to figure out, where we were and what we were doing, how close we were to catching him. He was also always trying to figure out how to just stay alive. It's hard to make a living when you've got the full force of the FBI on your tail. In his case, he had the power to seize the phone lines of any business in Los Angeles. And in this case, he targeted the Los Angeles radio station, I think it was FM 107, who was giving away 2 brand new Porsches that summer to the 107th caller. Well, Dark Dante was the 107th caller in both of those instances and won both Porsches and promptly sold them for cash so he could live on that. What the boy didn't realize was that constitutes money laundering in Los Angeles. And Dark Dante actually did more jail time for money laundering than he actually did for the cyber things that I got him on at that time. But it taught me that that's the way they live and then they react. So I said, well, look, Chinese New Year is coming up. If we bring this down right in the middle of Chinese New Year, if it's indeed a Chinese version of Dark Dante, he'll probably or she'll probably respond immediately. If, on the other hand, it's members of the PLA, who I call hackers and who were not limited in the resources they had to throw at me, but if indeed it were PLA members enjoying one of the most important holidays of the Chinese culture, it's very possible that the reaction won't occur until that next Monday when government employees come back from enjoying their holiday. So we brought it down. Absolute silence. Not a cyber whimper till that next Monday when all hell broke loose as they were trying and scrambling, looking for their back doors and whatever. So again, I don't share that with this group particularly as another anecdote that we needed to tell us that, you know, what we're up against here in this battle is nothing less than the full force and power of a nation state that's coming at us. And that, you know, it's in that environment that we have to be aware of the biases and prejudices that we bring to the environment as we do battle there. Shortly thereafter is when Michael Dell got a hold of me. He, as many of you know, he came back out of retirement and transformed his company, which was a box maker, into an end-to-end IT scalable solutions company. And in that process, woke up one night in a cold sweat. He had an epiphany, basically, and suddenly realized that embedded across this spectrum of IT solutions were security vulnerabilities, which, if unaddressed, could kick the credibility legs out from under his sales team that were trying to sell those solutions. A lot of those solutions were security solutions. He is turning himself into a security company as well. So he asked me if I wouldn't come, establish that converged house of physical and logical. I could bring my penchant for dealing with the insider threat piece that continued to plague and bog my mind because it puzzled me, and particularly in the wake of Snowden, when the government came out and said that all companies wishing to do business with them at the end of 2016 would have to show they had up and functioning what they called a viable insider threat program. Now, they didn't define or say what viable meant. We all sort of had to make that up as we had to go along. It was an act of hermeneutics again. I said, whatever they're ultimately going to say it means, it's going to probably have to show or involve the demonstrated use of what we call big data analytics, which were starting to emerge and which were really the first hint to me professionally that maybe my life stymied in the world of reactive detection might be coming to the end, that the possibility of leveraging AI's machine learning and mathematical algorithms was perhaps on the cusp of the horizon, something we could use. We surely knew we had to do better. I mean, back in the middle of the revolution, George Washington was apparently interviewed by members of the inquiring press, and they came up to George and said, "Hey, George, what keeps you up at night?" To which George is reported to have said it wasn't the Congress, the Continental Congress, which even then seemed incapable of doing anything very productive, nor was it his soldiers who were at that moment starving and freezing to death out in Valley Forge. George's answer as to what kept him up at night was they're spies. And for 240 years, we in the United States have been amassing an understanding and appreciation of these early data sets that should be indicators, hints or clues to us as to who might be that next spy. And yet, notwithstanding those 240 years and those various sources of data, we've only ever been able to play catch up. We've only ever been able to send a mope like myself in after the spy after he's already done us dirty. And it occurred to me that the reason we were stymied in reactive detection versus prevention in the area of espionage was because it was a big data problem. The early indicators were just too numerous and distributed across too many repositories for us to wrap our cognitively limited human carbon-based minds around. And that it wasn't until we developed software that allowed us to mine that data that fed into all those different repositories in these diverse environments that we were able to finally come up and start to make some strides. In fact, in that regard, we pulled together a big data analytical tool, Katanga and Statistica, both looking at structured and unstructured data. We pulled that together and gathered some samples from our federal program at Dell. In fact, we even tweaked the identity of or the profile of the director of that program in such a way that if indeed the algorithm worked, it would kick his name out as that individual about whom we should be most concerned. A couple of weeks into the program, the team came walking towards me and they had these very disturbed looks on their face. I said, "What's the matter? Is the pilot not working?" They said, "No, boss, the pilot's working, but what's concerning us is that according to it, the person about whom we should be most concerned is our boss." I said, "Yes," with a big smile on my face. And they kind of pulled back and said, we've been debating what would perhaps be your reaction to this news. And then we have to tell you that was not even on the radar. I said, well, I let him know what we had done. We had tweaked the identity, but that it really brought home with force the new power and strength that we were on the eve and the verge of actually wielding in this environment. In fact, it pulled me up short. It caused me to pause and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure we've really thought through all the ethical implications of having this kind of strength. Some of our people in our federal program had clearly signed up for that kind of scrutiny, but our employees who grew up in the former East Germany and had lived under the oppressive arm of the Stasi had never surely signed up for that. And I don't care how amiable and nice I may try and be with them, they're never going to buy my protestations that they can trust me as their big brother not to abuse that power. It's really a case, I think, where we're going to have to see that generation almost pass away before we can enter an environment where really the premium or the preference is going to be put on what we call contextual richness, and perhaps less the privacy that we hear so frequently discussed today. The millennials and their penchant for contextual richness want to, or would rather have it so when they arrive late at a hotel at night, the hotel knows that it's your favorite comfort food is spaghetti bolognese, and that if it's raining and the possibility of your meetings the next day being delayed or the traffic being heavy, that they would make your wake-up call 30 minutes earlier and call for your car to take you to your meetings just that much earlier. All of that coming together seamlessly in a way that it enriches the context of your life, and in a way that isn't cavalier or throws security to the wind, but it's just a different focus and an area of emphasis. And it's, again, borne out by a cultural practice that you see every day as you look at what the millennials will post out on social media, that beguiling specificity that is so often harvested and used against them. But clearly in the wake of our insider threat pilot, we proved to the organization that security was no longer a distasteful cost of doing business. We had now become an indispensable and inextricable aspect of advancing it. Indispensable because, well, inextricable because it was tied to a law. Indispensable because we delivered a solution, the cost of which was competitive in comparison to what Bob Moore, my buddy over at HP, was doing it. So we became indispensable because we added to the competitive price of the solution, and inextricable because we tied it to a law or regulation that kept us in the game. We were no longer just the guns, gates, guards, and geeks of yesterday. We are now effectively a duty owed by all. And when I say all, I do mean the wetware. And we're all probably familiar with the wetware. We've dealt with the hardware and the software over the years, and that's been challenging enough. That's really what's really always been a challenge ultimately for me. And I think this is what we mean when we talk, Alan, you talk about it being the people. On top of a person's shoulder is this orb. And on top of this orb is this mind that's 90 or 78% water. And it's the way in which that wetware can be beguiled, harvesting the specificity that our spouses or we even personally post out on social media can get beguiled in a spearfishing attack because of that specificity. In fact, such a thing happened to one of my employees whose little daughter was about to have her last game of the season. She's a cute little bug, but the fact of the matter is she can't play with beans. She'd never scored. So he told his wife, look, I've got to get this project done. Take her to her game. I'll get the project done. They go away. 2 hours later, they come back and the house erupts into chaos. Not only did the little bug score, she scored the winning goal. Now, his wife goes immediately to Facebook and posts that meaningful, memorable event in their daughter's life out on Facebook. My employee, of course, feels terrible. He is forever a horrible father who missed this singular event in his daughter's life. He comes Monday morning with his project. He turns it in. I give him the appropriate accolades, but it rings hollow when he thinks about what he missed out that weekend. He gets back to his desk, and one of the first emails he sees is, here's a picture of your daughter kicking the winning goal at last Saturday's soccer game. Now, it doesn't matter that he's a security professional. What comes down to is that at the end of the day is that he is first and foremost a guilt-ridden father, a human. And as Alan and Jeff and others have pointed out already this morning or this afternoon, it's the human aspect that the bad guys or the hackers really know how to exploit and use. And that's what they do here. And so he will, in the end, click as he knows he shouldn't have. And the malware will, of course, take its effect, resulting in that, once again, why it's not if, but when. And the question of the discussion then will turn, hopefully, if you've managed the expectations of the leadership, not to just being summarily fired, but instead a discussion of, one, how well were the assets critically identified? How well were those assets then enclaved? How well did we detect the compromise when it did come? And then how well and effectively did we contain it? It's now, I guess, measured in terms of what we call mean time to detection. How well did we expel it? And then this has become critical. How well did we leverage the new insights gained in raising the bar so that the next time it comes, they'll have a harder time at it. And with only 19% at the time, and maybe sometimes up as around 50% of the time, signature-based antivirus catching the malware or the viruses, we knew that next time was coming, which again gives way to that defense in depth structure that I and those of my age and generation have had to build in the corporations. These defense in depth complex structures that involve detection, incident response, triage, damage mitigation, and remediation. That defense in depth and that inevitability, that pessimism and that inevitability of compromise is also what has informed the formulation of some of the standards we're now seeing unfolded, like the NIST, where 3/4 of the elements of that whole model has as the unspoken presupposition that you will be compromised. So how well can you detect and respond and mitigate and repair and recover after that compromise is such a part of our culture that it's woven its way into that. And with 90% of all breaches being tied to malware, and that's the figure that the latest, or I guess it was 2 years ago, the Verizon report said that all breaches that we can identify, 90% of them are attributable to malware. If we could only finally get our act together when it came to antiviruses and battle there, 90% of the problem would be handled. We could turn our attention to the 10%, which is things like insider threat and other very challenging things. So we knew something had to happen, something new needed to come along. And in fact, it was predicted by Thomas Kuhn, the American physicist and philosopher, who predicted 50 years ago in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that periods of normal science are interrupted by revolutionary science. New paradigms change the rules of the game and our standards and our best practices. So the frustration that's been building in the community presaged the actual arrival of what Thomas Kuhn predicted. And in fact, at Dell, about three years ago, we reached that point, that saturation point. Our CTO over in the endpoint business said, hey, look, I've had it. No more sacrificial lambs. No more always having one victim from whom we could get that initial virus and then build the antivenom based on that sacrificial lamb. What he did is he went to an organization we had recently purchased called SecureWorks and asked them to pull together a bundle of evil that we hadn't seen in the cyber world before. We had a physical equivalent in Atlanta at the Center for Disease Control, but a cyber equivalent I'm not sure we'd ever seen. That this was a collection of over 4,100 instances of 0 days malware pieces that he could then throw against 60 different solutions that he had scanned the entire international environment community, came up with 60 players who all claimed to be the next best thing in antivirus. And against these 60s, he in turn launched this collection of 4,100 instances of 0 days ransomware, malware. And out of that bunch, one little unknown startup by the name of Cylance emerged with a 99.7% kill rate. Blew everybody away. The CTO was excited. Michael Dell got excited. They retested several times and continually got the same result. And Michael, I think, even tried to buy the company, but we'd just gone private, and he spent $22,000 million going private, and I maybe played it a little too cheaply. But in the end, he opted for the next best thing and signed an exclusive OEM relationship with the company and embeds that now in everything he offers the enterprise. Now, at this same time, and this is when I was just finishing up my insider threat test, the Dell team came back to me because I had sent them looking as soon as I arrived at Dell for the Chinese. I said, look, if we do business in the global marketplace, we compete against a state-owned enterprise, and we have intellectual property that would bolster the position of that state-owned enterprise in the marketplace, then they're either here or they're going to be here. Start looking. So they had gone off and started looking, and just at about the time I'm hearing this news of this solution called Cylance, my team's coming back and telling me, look, we found the Chinese, we expelled them, we've raised the bar in understanding of how they got us. They exploited the fact that our two-factor authentication wasn't as robustly deployed as it needed to be, and they had gone after my super users again. So I needed to bolster the security around my super users and my two-factor authentication. I built my roadmap. I had my plan. I was a man with a mission. I didn't need any distraction, particularly BS distractions like this. I knew this had to be BS because I bore the wounds of almost 15 years of anemic signature-based antivirus, and I knew this just couldn't be true. So I grabbed my ops team said, take this BS solution in the back, run what the Chinese just defeated us with, and when it fails, come back and tell me so I can tell Michael and these guys, and they'll stand down and leave me alone while I stay focused on this new roadmap. Because I promised Michael, look, anything you're going to sell to the outside world, I will make sure we deploy internally so I don't kick the credibility legs out from under your salespeople. And that meant I would be obliged to deploy this BS solution too, unless I could prove it was BS. 2 days later, the teams came walking back towards me. And these are the ops guys. These are the guys you never let have offices above the first floor because it's harder to commit suicide, right, on anything higher than the first floor. They come back, they're walking towards me, and they've got smiles on their faces. I thought, what is this? What's this about? I said, what? And he said, boss, we don't know what to tell you. But if we'd had this deployed, we would not have lost Christmas. That infrastructure that we're yet building out further now with greater cost and complexity and resources wouldn't be necessary because it would have stopped pre-execution the virus from ever having launched in the first place. The solution determines whether or not a file is good or bad purely by the information that it contains in the file, and is capable of replicating that understanding and growing that on an ongoing basis. And then it does that because we determined that there was patterns that have emerged in files and how they're just constructed over the years of the development and emergence of the internet. They basically, our mathematicians, mined what we call the good files and then the bad files and extracted out of the good files the millions of attributes that make them good and the millions of attributes that make the bad file bad, attached an integer value to that can then be ported over into a math model, an algorithm that can sit on the endpoint using very little footprint. Most DAT files now that sustain signature-based antiviruses are so large that they become the end user's computer becomes a boat anchor more than anything else. And when it's updating, heaven forbid you have anything you need to get done that day because the CPU consumption goes way down and your machine becomes very ineffective. But if this very little CPU consumption occurs, very little space on the machine is required. And in fact, you don't even have to update it like you also often do with a signature-based solution, which is very, very important given the way humans often deploy and act when it comes to updating their signatures. Humans are simply incapable of keeping up. And again, these predictive patterns allows us to differentiate between the safe and the bad files to the tune of this 99.7% effective rate. So it's the artificial intelligence without being explicitly programmed, the assistance that without the intervention of humans that allows this accelerated engagement and is providing a disruption to the industry unlike anything I've seen in the last 2 decades. And again, and Alan, I think of all the things we've seen over the years of our engagement in the industry, that we've seen a lot of things come and go, but there's something about this that tells me that it has some sticking power to it. The future of malware, even though prevention, even though we in the security industry weren't the first ones, I mean, healthcare and insurance and high frequency trading embraced AI, machine learning well in advance of us, but hey, we finally have gotten there. And I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of at the pace at which we got there, but we now have it and can leverage it to the tune that it now has demonstrated itself capable of acting. And that it won't just be in the area of antivirus that we can wield this power. If you think of the other challenges, and some of them we've already mentioned this afternoon, the distributed denial of services, but clearly also passwords and identity. We're talking about what we call continuous authentication, where the same power and strength that will extract and leverage the value and understanding it has of those millions of attributes that make a file good, can at the same time extract those same attributes about each of us as a human being and make it such that there will be a time when my granddaughter will come up to me and say, Grandpa, was it really the case that at one time you had to enter an alphanumeric sequence in order to gain access to your computer? And it'll be that foreign to us as we continue to see these things unfold. So basically what I say we've done is we've mapped the genomic structure of the internet, which allows us to predict and then block pre-execution in real time these viruses, no matter how they may try to tweak and change them. And that's why signatures are so easily to get around. Is all you have to do is morph or pack the signature just in the slightest. And the bad guys will do this with the tools that they can get out on the dark web in instances like Satan, where you have a ransom as a service being provided, where you can actually tweak and change and alter the ransomware right there on the spot to the point that you're assured that it'll circumvent any form of currently existing signature-based antivirus. So that's what we've got in place and have been working. You may have become and heard about this through the release of the congressional report chronicling the OPM breach. We don't usually talk about our customers, but the OPM congressional report called out that it was indeed Cylance and the way in which we leverage AI and machine learning that enable us to determine that, in fact, that organization was still compromised even after they've been declared clean by signature-based assessments. So again, this approach also leverages and liberates a lot of resources when you think of all that's involved in updating DAT files, the triage, the classification, and the testing in production and out of production systems. And then, it can take weeks at times to get that file updated. All that process and time is now being extracted and liberating those resources. Clearly, I tell my friends and my peers, I feel like I'm Bill Murray in the Groundhog Day. I thought I was trapped in this never-ending cycle of reactive detection, never to see the light of day when it comes to proactive detection. But I can say with confidence that I believe and know the groundhog is dead. He was impaled by a cyber lance that was driven by AI and machine learning, and will drive and infuse new life into our profession. I've seen it already. But as in any case, I don't believe that this new solution will lose its efficacy over time like we've seen so many other solutions. And that was recently borne out by an SE Labs report that through the worst that 2016, 2017, 2018 put at us in the way of malware, they went back to our 2015 version of the math model. We call her Infinity. We threw the worst that we did in those 3 years at her as she existed in 2015. And the result is that the end user would have been protected even if they hadn't updated their model for over 2 years. That's as much as 33 months on average of a predictive advantage. That's like the Minority Report, the movie that many of you may be familiar with, actually moving from the world of fiction to being real with a 22 to 33 month predictive advantage. Clearly, it's a dawn of a new age. There was Galileo it was Copernicus that first proposed the heliocentric model of the universe. He had the good sense to die shortly thereafter, and it was poor Galileo that had to champion that model. We're not naive or keenly aware of what we're going to face as we propose a new paradigm. And that's why I say in the heat of battle that's now emerged, and you can see it. You hear so many people out there now, everybody's saying, hey, we do AI, we do machine learning. There's a fog of battle that's now created that it's hard to penetrate if you're a consumer or an enterprise. And that's why at the end of the day, I say, don't be beguiled by someone who exudes the enthusiasm I do for something such as this. I say, prove for yourself the power and strength of the solution. Finally, as a sort of a parting note, I had to make reference to the comments recently made by Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, and Elon Musk. I think all three of them have issued what I call clarion calls of caution when it comes to the engagement and embrace of AI and machine learning. To that, I would only say, well, look, any new technology has always been a two-edged sword, one that carries with the possibility of being leveraged in some untoward way. It's only by taking a deep breath, stepping back, and constantly adjusting as the adversaries do that we will, I think, still enjoy a competitive lead ahead of those adversaries and be able to truly appreciate the fruits that this new technology will afford for our industry. So much so that when the next time I meet all of you, when I'm back from Paris and I run into you in New York and I come up and say, may you live in an interesting time, there won't be a doubt in any of your minds that which I pronounced upon you was not indeed a cursing, but a new paradigm benediction. John, I think with that, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, John. I'll open it up for questions. We'll wait a minute or two. Because again, with the delay in the streaming, but question I had for you was basically, can this be more seen as instead of user behavior analysis, application behavior analysis?
Yeah, I get the way I would contrast it against those is the time at which a lot of that behavior analysis happens is post-execution. The bad guy has already acted or is advancing his ill-gotten gains or his plan against you, where this is actually preempting, pre-execution, almost before you have the substance that you would normally want to wrap your analytical mind around. It looks at the genomic code and stops pre-execution, the virus from ever launching. Even if it's just been packed maybe seconds before, doesn't matter. It's still capable of identifying that. And if it's an instance where, let's say, they had a completely blank slate and there was no lingering genetic code that would have triggered it as possibly being evil or statistically leaning towards the dark side. The time and speed at which to capture that new variant and update the math model is just a fraction of the time and the processes that are associated with the old signature approach.
Great. Well, thank you. Okay.